like to extend a warm welcome to all the distinguished journalists and members of the media in the city of Chennai to this interaction. I want to take up from where Professor Upasana Mahanta, the Dean of our Office of Admissions and Outreach at Global University left, which is that the aspiration that is a deeply embedded aspiration in India, which is to build world-class universities. This is not something that emerged very recently. In fact, the Indian history and ancient India's evolution saw the development of Nalanda, Takshashila, Vallabhi and Vikramshila type institutions, which in their own time had contributed to the rich civilizational heritage of India. They were truly global universities, they were multidisciplinary institutions, they had faculty and students from other parts of the world coming into the Indian subcontinent and experiencing a truly world-class education. Today, we have 75 years of Indian independence. As we celebrate the 75th year of Indian independence, we have numerous challenges that are facing the higher education sector. We have a huge challenge with regard to the demographic situation in our country. The fact remains that India has 850 million people who are less than 35 years of age. At the dawn of Indian independence, the life expectancy in India was approximately 35 and today it is 71. We also have this extraordinary aspiration among young people to receive high quality education which can be truly transformative, which essentially means that we need to have more institutions and we need to have better quality. Now the tragedy is the gross enrollment ratio, despite 75 years of institutional evolution and development, remains hovering around 25%, and we need to educate more people. There are 1,000 universities and 45,000 colleges in India. Despite the expansion of Indian higher education sector to nearly 35 million students who are part of that sector, we still have major challenges of a large number of young people wanting to get into the education sector. And so I want to start by saying that the first and most important challenge that we have before us is how do we balance quality and quantity? We need to have more institutions, but the natural tendency when we expand the sector is we end up compromising on quality and we need to focus on excellence. And that's one major objective that the national education policy was trying to achieve and respond to, and which is connected to our aspiration to build world-class universities. The second major challenge that the national education policy was trying to achieve or respond to is that how do we build research universities? How do we benchmark Indian universities among the best in the world? As many of you, as distinguished members of the media fraternity know, that consistently for many years, several prime ministers, including our current prime minister, but also the previous prime minister, the former president Pranab Mukherjee, all of them have lamented about the fact that not a single Indian university is among the top 100 in the world. Very few Indian universities are among the top 200 in the world. And in fact, when the major rankings organizations such as the QS ranks Indian universities, you will be surprised to know that out of the 1,000 Indian universities which are there, only 22 of them end up being featured among the 1,000 universities in the world. There are approximately 40,000 universities in the world and 1,000 in India, but only 22 of Indian universities end up being ranked among the top 1,000 in the world. That essentially means that we have a major challenge with regard to quality, which I talked about, and one of the reasons why we have not been able to be featured in the rankings is that relatively poor quality and impact of research and scholarship and publications emerging out of Indian universities. And so what the national education policy was trying to address is that how do we build a research ecosystem? How do we create a culture of research among our institutions? How do we ensure that our faculty members are driven by motivation to create knowledge across different disciplines and contribute to research through publications, especially in Scopus Index and peer-reviewed journals. This aspiration to balance between focus on teaching on the one hand and contributing research was another dichotomy that the national education policy was trying to address. And that's a second major challenge the NEP was trying to address. The third major aspect of the NEP is another important challenge that we face in India, which is the dichotomy and the dilemma between public and private institutions. At the dawn of independence, we ended up creating great public institutions, including IITs and central universities and state public universities. But since the late 80s and the early 90s, Indian higher education moved towards expansion in privatization of higher education. We saw the emergence of private higher education institutions. In fact, the IT revolution that we have seen across many parts of South India, including cities like Chennai and Bengaluru and Hyderabad and other parts of India, owes a lot to the emergence of engineering colleges, which ended up creating a fertile ground for the expansion of the IT sector. Dramatic changes happened with regard to the emergence of the private sector in relation to education. But also, it's important to mention that not all private sector education was focusing on quality and excellence. A lot of mediocrity and deeply embedded unethical practices were brought into the privatization of education, because of which academic standards were compromised. So today we have a situation where 70% of Indian higher education institutions are in the private sector. And more than 70% of students in Indian higher education are also studying in private higher education institutions, adding to the affiliated colleges and also the private universities, the deemed universities and other such institutions. So there has been a tectonic shift in the world of higher education, in which both in terms of the number of higher education institutions and the number of students studying in higher education institutions, the private sector dominates and dominates quite significantly. This essentially means, from a public policy standpoint, we need to understand how we are going to be regulating this entire sector. And so the balancing act is to recognize the role of the private sector, but also to recognize the importance of corporate philanthropy and other types of empowerment, because the state has consistently reduced its role, including its ability to fund and contribute to resource for the university system. So the public-private sector divide is something that the national education policy was trying to address. The next major aspect of what the national education policy was trying to address is to recognize the role of internationalization in Indian higher education. Quite remarkably, I mentioned Nalanda, Takshashila, Vallabhi and Vikramshila. These institutions were truly global institutions, attracting students and faculty from around the world over 2,000 years ago. But the reality is, we have not been able to play that type of role in many of our institutions, especially after we built this higher education sector in the last 75 years of independence. So the national education policy has come up with innovative ideas in recognizing the role of internationalization, including the possibility of establishing international universities and their campuses in India. I, for one, strongly believe that internationalization should happen at multiple levels. Not only the effort to build foreign campuses in India, that may or may not happen. What we really need to focus on is to have partnership with international universities. Indian universities, including Jindal, have extensive partnership with universities around the world. These partnerships should benefit our students, including for promoting faculty exchanges, student exchanges, joint degree programs, dual degree programs, study abroad programs, immersion programs, joint teaching, joint research, joint conferences, joint publications, and other such collaborative initiatives with regard to the emphasis on internationalization. The national education policy drives that agenda quite fervently. The next big thing that the national education policy is argued about is achieving the balance between regulation and governance. I've always believed that Indian higher education system is over-regulated and under-governed. A lot of what the National Education Policy has talked about, and this has already begun to be implemented now, is how do we make sure that universities in India become more autonomous, more independent, how they can evolve their own internally well-established practices with a view to raise the quality and excellence. This process of regulatory reforms has already been implemented. The first stage of the regulatory reforms were done when the Indian Institutes of Management and their governing councils, the government withdrew its role from the IIMs when it comes to empowering the governing councils. The second step in that process was when the government announced the policy relating to graded autonomy, in which universities were empowered with and given the status of autonomous institutions with a view to empowering them and to have them function more autonomously. And the third step in that process was the declaration of institutions of eminence with a view to giving more autonomy and more regulatory freedom for universities to function in that manner. In that same spirit, the National Education Policy is looking at even greater reforms and independence and autonomy for universities, and the recent announcements made by the University Grants Commission when it comes to the dual degree programs and internationalization and other such initiatives augurs well and in many ways informs and contributes to the vision of the National Education Policy. Now the question that we have before all of us is that, why do we need to do all of this? Well, I think it's important to recognize that the future of India and the world is going to inextricably depend upon how we are going to harness the energy and indeed the resources of the young people who are going to be educated, empowered, and also end up having meaningful careers in their life. This challenge, the demographic challenge that we are going to face in India and Asia and Africa and Latin America and Middle East, even beyond the Western world, means that we need to educate our people and provide high quality education. I don't see any reason why, if the last 100 years of history holds any truth for us, it is a century for Asia. If we were to redraw the destiny of India and Asia for the next 100 years, I am convinced that it is the universities which ought to be driving that mission. And we need to focus and pay a lot more attention on the future of universities. Universities are not only knowledge creating, knowledge dissemination and research institutions, they are also institutions that are involved in ideations. They are also institutions which are going to respond to the big problems of our time, be it on issues relating to environment, climate change, sustainability, be it on issues relating to migration, terrorism, national security. Almost every aspect of governance, including economic and social development, it is going to be driven by the ideas that are generated by scholars and thinkers and researchers in universities, which can ultimately help in policy making. One of the things that has not happened in India as much as it should, and the National Education Policy also talks about, is that how can universities and academics in universities can contribute to policy making? How can the ideas and research that emerges out of universities can help and inform the policy making process, the law making process? This is an area that is going to be enormous work that needs to be done. The next big thing that the National Education Policy talks about is the interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinary university that we need to move towards. Gone are the days when all of us can aim to have what I've called bracketed and fragmented approach towards education, whereby every degree program that we offer is, myopically designed with limited options and opportunities for students to have holistic education. The National Education Policy, in line with the vision of promoting world-class education, has talked about the idea of having a more multidisciplinary approach towards education, in which students can not only study courses that are relevant to the core aspect of the discipline that they're studying, but also they can take other courses in the form of electives and design courses from other schools and programs that they are part of. This is almost a sine qua non of a good university, and that's something that the national education policy has talked about. The other thing the national education policy has laid a lot of emphasis on is funding and the need for resources. They talked about the idea of a national research ecosystem, NRF, National Research Foundation, but they also talked about how the GDP investment in higher education is going to be substantially increased. Now here I have a view on the matter. I strongly believe that our dependence on state alone cannot solve the problem. The state capacities in funding higher education is going to be dependent upon different state government priorities, but also the kind of emphasis that is given in primary and secondary education, and lot of effort is going to be going into that sector. For universities, it's absolutely critical that we also think in terms of private philanthropy, we think in terms of corporate social responsibility initiatives and other types of funding and resources that needs to be drawn out of sectors beyond the government and government agencies, and that is going to help in not only providing funding for research but also funding for scholarships and fellowships to provide access to education. I studied in two good Indian institutions, Loyola College Madras and University of Delhi, after which I got the Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and then I did another master's degree in Oxford University, another master's at Harvard University, and a doctorate from the University of Hong Kong. I got 100% scholarships to study in these world-class universities. We need to bring that vision into Indian higher education so that access to high-quality education in public or private sector should not be limited to people only who can afford, but scholarships and fellowships should be provided so that students have access to high-quality, world-class education. I want to end by saying that the vision of building world-class universities should not be limited to developing countries. True democratization of higher education is possible only if the aspiration to high quality and institutes of excellence is not limited to developing countries. Today, the world-class universities is lopsided in terms of its presence. Most great universities ended up being located in North America, Canada, United Kingdom, Western Europe, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taipei, Australia, New Zealand, and very few institutions are hardly present in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the developing part of Southeast Asia, none from Africa, and hardly a few from Latin America. China is one exception where China is jumping above its weight when it comes to having world-class universities. India is much lesser situated there, where we can be, where we should be, and we deserve to be. And my hope is the national education policy could be a potential game changer for Indian universities to A, build world-class institute of learning within the existing institutions, and pave way for building new generation world-class universities which can compete with the best in the world and can provide opportunities for them. One of the remarkable strengths of Indian higher education system is its ability to attract some of the finest minds to be able to make their choices to come into academia. This is an area that deserves more attention as more and more bright students from India are preparing to think about careers, and we need to attract them to come into academia to become teachers and researchers and professors as opposed to choosing other walks of life, because the best talent has to be brought into university and not confined only to the private sector, to the companies, to government departments and other aspects and walks of life. I want to end here and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.